Next on Secrets of War. It was the longest, most crucial battle of World War II. The struggle for the Atlantic pitted Germany's lethal U-boat fleet against every weapon the Allies could muster to protect their vital supply routes to Great Britain. The story of naval intelligence, code breaking, and code stealing in the Battle of the Atlantic is next on Secrets of War.
On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, England declared war. Almost immediately, the legendary Battle of the Atlantic was joined. This was a conflict neither side was prepared for. There were only 27 ocean-going U-boats in the German fleet, and the Allies had barely enough anti-submarine warships to counter even this small threat. Both sides braced themselves for the onslaught. After France fell to Hitler's blitzkrieg in 1940, the balance of power at sea as well as on land shifted strongly to Germany's advantage. Britain was dependent on the supply of men, equipment, and food from North America to continue her war effort. German bombing raids had battered England's weapons production. Britain could not stand alone. Supplies had to cross the Atlantic, and that could be achieved by shipping alone. Convoys, which had been started on a limited basis at the outbreak of war, were rapidly expanded, and additional escort ships were scraped together in desperation. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz of the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, had one mission: to eliminate these convoy supply routes and throttle the British enemy. All available German U-boats were ordered to attack the convoys on their way to England. Ultimately, though, the Battle of the Atlantic was a secret war for information. In a vast ocean, coded communications made the difference between finding the enemy or being found.
The Battle of the Atlantic was the most important battle of World War II, the most fundamental battle. Germany needed to win the Battle of the Atlantic because it was the only way that it was going to be able to destroy Great Britain.
Following Germany's defeat in World War I, the Allied nations were eager to ensure that carnage of such bloody magnitude would never happen again. The war to end all wars would be the last. To ensure peace, the Allies subjected Germany to the strict Treaty of Versailles. This agreement severely limited weapons production. The Germans attempted to circumvent these restrictions by establishing shell companies in Holland and by developing treaties with the Soviet Union.
In the Treaty of Versailles, it was prohibited for Germany to build aircraft and submarines because the Germans had great experience in submarine building in the First World War, and they constructed some submarines for Finland, for Sweden, for the Netherlands, for Turkey, and also for the Soviet Union.
These agreements allowed Germany to develop technology for battleships and U-boats, as well as to adopt various strategies instrumental in the Blitzkrieg and radio war.
When Hitler came to power in 1933, he made it fairly clear that he was going to rearm Germany come what may.
This was a total violation of the Treaty of Versailles. The Allies laid down, they didn't say anything about it, and Germany continued to rearm.
The Allied nations were exhausted and in disarray. They'd lost an entire generation to one war. Surely such devastation could not be repeated. After World War I, Britain reduced funding for its navy. A choice was made to manufacture fewer, larger ships. It was a smaller navy that entered World War II.
The unfortunate reality was that at the outbreak of war, Britain had no more than 200 destroyers available. And destroyer has many other roles in the Navy, quite aside from convoy escort. So there had to be compromises. So Britain adopted smaller ships that were much simpler and could be built more quickly. Churchill at one point referred to the corvettes, which were the most numerous for the early part of the war, as cheap and nasties.
With the fall of France to the Germans, the British Navy's major ally, the French fleet, became the enemy. In an effort to help England, the U.S. provided 50 destroyers. In exchange, Britain provided the U.S. with sites on which to station their military bases in Bermuda, Newfoundland, and the British West Indies. The American destroyers joined the ranks of the convoys that crossed the Atlantic from various North American ports to Liverpool and Glasgow in Great Britain. The convoy system was critical for transporting much-needed men and supplies across the North Atlantic. The principle of the convoy was to sail the merchant ships in a large group of 40 or more, and to provide a surrounding escort in the form of warships and aircraft.
40 or 50 ships sailing together are not visible at sea from much farther away than a single ship. The Germans would have maybe one chance to attack. So instead of sending out 40, 50, or 60 ships independently, where the Germans would be able to shoot at them like ducks in a barrel, instead all of the ships would sail together under protection.
Watching the convoys head out to sea was one of the most magnificent sights in all of World War II. The ships would file out of the harbor and form a line 20 miles long. They would organize into as many as 6 short columns, roughly 3/4 of a mile apart. Generally, 6 escort ships would be assigned to the convoy. 2 would be stationed ahead of it, 1 on either flank, and 2 sweeping around the stern. From shore, there would be ships as far as the eye could see, since the perimeter of a convoy could stretch to more than 100 miles. When convoys left Nova Scotia, seaplanes of the Royal Canadian Air Force circled until they reached their maximum range of 400 miles from land. Then, when the ships approached England, British seaplanes and land-based bombers would meet the convoy and patrol above it. If aircraft were present, the convoys were safe.
World War II submarines are very slow underwater, and if they are running on the surface and sight an aircraft, they immediately have to dive. So it wouldn't be sighted by the aircraft. The convoy would move off into safety.
At the start of the war, it was almost pitiful, the shortage of escorts. Convoys used to go out with half a dozen escorts, not nearly enough to protect a convoy. Also, we went out without equipment. I mean, my first convoy trip, which was a very short one, I'm glad to say, and not very far, it was along the coast, but we had a wooden gun, which could appear to be a real gun through a periscope, but it was just there to say we're in business.
The escort ships acted as highly effective, well-armed, protective shields to the convoy. They never sailed a straight course. Instead, the escort ships swept back and forth in their sectors, searching for the enemy by sonar and radar. But radar had difficulty picking up the very low profile of submarines on the surface, and sonar's maximum range was only about 2,000 meters. These were not perfect solutions. Due to the fall of France and increased U-boat activity in the North Atlantic, Britain tried to perfect and expand the system of shore-based, high-frequency direction-finding stations, codenamed HFDUF. Stations were soon developed in Iceland, Canada, Bermuda, and the Caribbean. Within time, the Allies found that when a German warship signaled, it could be detected from 3 or 4 different directions, revealing a relatively accurate location. Escort by air was not ideal. Bombers and escort aircraft on both sides of the Atlantic could only fly 400 miles offshore before they had to turn back. This limited range created an area in the center of the ocean known as the Black Hole. It was here that the major battles between convoys and U-boats took place, beyond the prying eyes of Allied aircraft. A key component of Dönitz's U-boat strategy were the deadly clusters of submarines, known to the Allies as wolf packs. At night, Dönitz would deploy as many U-boats as possible on the surface, allowing swift and almost invisible movement. If one of them identified a convoy, it became what was known as a shadower, hanging back to send signals about the location to Dönitz's headquarters.
The way it was done was, Dönitz would begin in the fall of 1940 to put his U-boats on patrol in patrol lines. So the U-boats would be at visibility distance from each other, say 30 miles apart.
A typical communication sent to headquarters as an encoded message might read, "We have contacted a convoy at grid number C12, section 4. Dönitz had devised a scheme of grids which would inform the U-boats of a convoy's location. The speed and range of communication gear was vital in the Atlantic. The technology was perfected during the interwar years when Germany committed to a radio-based infrastructure. From this, all military commands flowed. Since radio dispatches traveled through the air, they were vulnerable to interception. Secret codes had to defy decryption.
Dönitz used radio more than practically any other naval commander in order to personally lead the U-boat campaign, to concentrate in a single spot all of the available information, a very sound principle of war, and to make sure that each of the individual U-boats had a fairly full picture and knew exactly what it was to do based on that full picture.
Germany's total dependence on radio communications proved to be a deciding factor in the Battle of the Atlantic. Dönitz realized that the only way in which the U-boats could work effectively was in concerted action. He personally commanded all U-boat radio communications from his headquarters located in the tiny village of Bernau. Reports from the submarines would contain information on their location, the convoy's location, and the convoy's speed and direction. This information would never be sent back to Dönitz unencrypted. Nor could he direct the submarines without taking security precautions. Otherwise, the Allies would intercept communications and react with lethal countermeasures. Secret communications required an elaborate encoding procedure, and the Germans were perfecting an encryption technology to perform it. As the Battle of the Atlantic continued through the summer of 1940, it was clear that the Allies were in trouble. Britain was unprepared for the Code War. Although they knew the importance of reading the German ciphers, the British had no idea that their own codes were being read.
Code breaking is a terrifically useful form of intelligence because it enables you to get the actual very words of the enemy. It's kind of like sticking your head into the enemy football huddle.
Allied transmissions were regularly decoded by the Germans, who often discovered the convoy's location almost at the same time that Allied headquarters did.
The main problem for the British was that they were still relying on a kind of World War I era system of communication security, basically on code books, which they distributed widely through the fleet and through their own merchant marine and to their allies. The Germans could read these code books, could reconstruct them, and so had a good sense of the general disposition of the convoys and their routes and the composition of the ships and which were the major targets and so on.
The German code-breaking unit, the B-Dienst, had been decrypting British naval codes throughout the early stages of the war. To conceal and encrypt their own messages, the German armed forces purchased an electric coding system known as the Enigma machine. Developed in Holland in the early 1920s, Enigma was able to encrypt messages so thoroughly that the Germans were convinced it was infallible. Codes were entered into the Enigma machine using typewriter-like keys. Pressing any key would produce a different letter in code. For example, the letter B would appear as an H one time, and X the next time, and so forth. The heart of the machine was the wired code wheel. It was capable of turning 26 times, which is why a different letter would appear each time a B was pressed. But the Enigma had 3 wheels working together, allowing 26 to the 3rd power, or more than 17,000 different combinations for each letter. In order to decipher the message, it was essential to have the starting position or setting for each wheel. Despite the challenge, the Poles, working with the French, had some success breaking the original Enigma. However, Dönitz intended to make his Kriegsmarine Enigma even more difficult to decipher. He remembered an incident from World War I when a German light cruiser, the Magdeburg, ran aground in the Baltic Sea.
The Russians, near whose territory this was, captured this ship and found in it the German Navy's secret code book.
The Russians delivered the code books to the First Lord of the Admiralty at the time, Winston Churchill. The British deciphered the books and read German naval messages throughout the war. This intelligence coup was instrumental to the Allied victory in World War I. Churchill echoed these sentiments in his book, The World Crisis After the Great War.
When the Germans read this in Churchill's memoirs, they realized that if there were ever going to be another war, they had to have a system of secret communications which would prevent anybody from using any captured documents.
Upon reading Churchill's history, Dönitz swore that his Enigma settings would never be compromised. So far, he had kept his promise.
Essential to the U-boat strategy was the use of Enigma to keep the messages secret. Therefore, it was almost central to all of Germany's naval strategy in whatever war might come.
Bletchley Park was the center of Britain's code-breaking activity. Here, people such as Alan Turing, inventor of the world's first computer, plied their highly technical and demanding trade. The cryptanalysts had succeeded in breaking the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht Enigma codes. Due to better security, the Kriegsmarine Enigma was still a frustrating mystery to them.
The Navy's use of it was more complicated than the Air Force's use of it. Their signaling discipline was superb. They had special extra features. which our boffins, led by Turing, could not get into. Though we had this sophisticated machinery which was reading the Air Force, we could not get into the Navy.
So early on in the war, and one of the reasons that Dönitz had great success in 1940 and early 1941, the so-called first happy time of the U-boat commanders, was that they had a great advantage in the intelligence war, in that they were able to read a significant proportion of the convoy signals in time to get U-boats into position to take advantage of.
Dönitz and his U-boats reigned supreme. For the first 18 months of the war, the undersized U-boat fleet was able to wreak havoc with the convoys crossing the North Atlantic routes. Monthly Allied convoy losses ranged from about 160,000 tons in September of 1939 to about 350,000 tons a year later. The British needed a minimum of 17 million tons of equipment and supplies a year to survive, or about 1.5 million tons a month. These losses placed England's survival in severe jeopardy. The Germans could easily detect the convoys, while the Allies seemed to be completely in the dark when it came to locating the U-boats.
Dönitz, back in Germany, or as it was later on in France, would then order the U-boats all to concentrate on that particular place and send them around so that there would be so many U-boats, the escorts for the convoy wouldn't be able to attack them all.
Dönitz's headquarters would alert every submarine in the vicinity of a convoy and order them to converge silently. Then Dönitz would wait until sundown. As darkness fell, he would issue the command to attack. As many as 10 submarines would converge on a convoy.
Actually getting in between the rows of the merchant shipping, blasting away, creating total chaos. Absolutely nightmare conditions, because ships would be going down all over the place. There'd be dramatic explosions.
These battles continued as the ships moved ahead, but the slowest convoys could make only 6 or 8 knots.
You get near collisions. There are men screaming for help in oil who are going to die within a few minutes.
The convoys proved to be easy prey for the wolf packs. Once Germany occupied France, it lost no time neutralizing the French fleet and sent its U-boats to bases on the Atlantic coast in the Bay of Biscay.
They were very close, so that the German submarines had to go only 1 or 1.5 days to the operational area to attack the very weakly defended convoys at the time, and to use all their torpedoes and go back to the base to reload the torpedoes and go out again.
This move allowed Dönitz to keep more submarines at sea longer, which further empowered the Kriegsmarine.
Churchill's policy after the fall of France was to bring the United States into the war by any means necessary. And one of his tools in bringing the United States in was to encourage naval collaboration. So right from the fall of France, the American and the British navies are talking secretly.
In February of 1940, during a commando raid on the German trawler Krebs, the crew of the British destroyer Somali managed to retrieve the Kriegsmarine Enigma settings for that month. Once the information arrived at Bletchley Park and was placed in Turing's hands, it led to a tremendous number of solutions. Needless to say, Turing wanted more settings. Harry Hinsley started to devise a method to retrieve them.
Germans kept two little trawlers on station in the Arctic. One off Greenland, one off Northern Iceland, for weather reporting. They had the Enigma. Believe it or not.
Hinsley knew that if they were at sea for 7 weeks, the trawlers would have to have more than 1 month's setting sheets on board. The current setting sheet would be on the operator's desk. Next to his desk was a bucket of water. If the trawler was boarded, the operator would simply drop the sheet in the bucket and the vital codes would wash away. But the next month's settings were kept in the safe. The British planned to raid a trawler, seize the papers, and get out, what they called a cutting operation. On the 7th of May, 1941, they targeted the weather trawler München between Iceland and Norway.
I was the center of the spider's web. I had a man from the Admiralty come to my section, to my room, you see, and we rehearsed what I guessed he would find when he got there, you see. I was the chap telling them what to look for and where to go for it and so on. Of course, the Navy did a beautiful job.
The raid was a glorious success. Later, they repeated the operation on another weather ship, the Lauenburg.
And these poor little ships, just little trawlers, cruising along, and then suddenly over the horizon would come a British cruiser supported by 2 super destroyers swooping in, and they moved fast. They were coming in 40 kilometers an hour again in order to capture the ship before the crew could destroy their coding books.
2 days after the raid on the München, a convoy battle took place on the other side of Iceland. The U-110 was forced to the surface during the fight. Joe Baker Creswell was the commander of the closest Allied ship.
And he set course immediately to ram this U-boat and sink it and send it to the bottom.
As he headed toward the hapless U-110, a thought flashed into Baker Creswell's mind, the story of the saved codebooks of the Magdeburg.
So he called out, full stop. The ship came to a full stop, and he sent over then rapidly a boarding party.
The U-boat's survivors were quickly rescued and taken below. Then Sub-Lieutenant David Baum climbed down the lower conning tower. Once he was inside the U-110, he discovered that all was silent,
except for some kind of a hissing sound and the noise of the motors maybe ticking over. He managed to get not just the Enigma machine, but had some of the keying documents.
The U-110 papers were quickly sent to Bletchley Park. These were the final pieces of the naval Enigma puzzle. With the captured papers from the München, the Lauenburg, and the U-110, Bletchley Park was finally able to crack the Kriegsmarine's Enigma machine. This was the moment the Allies had been waiting for. Now they could locate the U-boat packs and, more importantly, know where they were going and how to avoid them. Convoys could be rerouted and made invisible to the German fleet. The Allies were back in the Battle of the Atlantic.
With this information, the British were able to route convoys clear of the concentrations of German submarines.
We were steered towards a convoy, and when we got there, the convoy wasn't there. In other words, somebody apparently expected us to appear. We were attacked in the middle of the night by airplanes, which in our opinion couldn't see us somehow, but they knew we were there. And so somehow we had the feeling that the enemy had some means of locating of where we were.
Dönitz's victories dropped from 325,000 tons of cargo in May 1941 to 90,000 tons by July. Despite this enormous decrease, the Kriegsmarine's faith in the Enigma machine did not waver. They could not imagine that the code had been broken. Dönitz convened committees to review all possible ways in which the British were discovering the locations of his submarines. Blame was usually attributed to French spies or British spies in French ports where the U-boats were based.
We were at that time totally convinced that nothing could break that code, even if somebody would receive it and try to decode it. Only after the war, of course, did we find out that we were very wrong in this kind of attitude.
The irony is, by the end of the war, virtually every Enigma code was being read as fast as the Germans themselves, the recipients, were reading it.
The Allies saved hundreds of thousands of tons of merchant marine ships carrying men and material to Great Britain. Dönitz's dependency on radio transmissions, which had led to so many successes in the early months of the war, was proving to be his downfall. Then in December 1941, the high seas battle took a new turn. On the 7th of December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and the United States declared war on Japan.
That since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed.
Hitler promptly declared war on America. Churchill's prayers of bringing America's wealth, resources, and technological expertise into the war were answered.
Then when the United States comes into the war in December of 41, the curve just takes off. And as the U.S. industrial machine mass produces ships, using mass production techniques for the first time on a grand scale, you can see that Germany's days in any material sense are numbered.
Having found no convoys all the way through the second half of 1941, and having declared war on America, Dönitz says the best thing to do is to send all the boats to the American seaboard.
For 2 years, American ships had been traveling unescorted along the Atlantic coast. Now that the United States was in the war, merchant ships on the East Coast were fair game for the U-boats on the prowl.
So we had them all strung out from the St. Lawrence down to the Caribbean, where there was no convoy system, where all the lights were still on, and the boats just sitting off New York Harbor or the St. Lawrence entrance or among the islands in the Caribbean and shooting the ships as they came along in full electric light, you see.
Dönitz's U-boats sank 137 ships, or about 828,000 tons of supplies, a catastrophic number. Then another major setback for the Allies occurred.
Dönitz upped the difficulty of solution by adding later on another wheel. So instead of 3 wheels, there were 4 wheels in the Enigma, and made a number of other technical complications to this.
The fourth rotor added a tremendous number of new possibilities and made decryption of the Kriegsmarine signals almost impossible.
But where this was somewhat positive for the Allies is that their convoys doing the absolutely critical transport across the North Atlantic were not coming under attack, so that the German intelligence advantage was not as critical as it might have been during the first half of 1942.
America's entry into the war was timely for Bletchley Park. To solve the fourth rotor, Alan Turing required enormous decryption machines called bombs, which were far beyond the resources of the British. Bletchley Park welcomed the Americans into the process by sharing more intelligence information. In turn, the U.S. government began to build Turing's massive calculating machines to tackle the 4-rotor combination. Without current Enigma code settings, it became clear that the Allies required a more robust anti-submarine strategy. The Air Force was marshaled to the defense.
One of the most important aspects of this development has been the construction of air bases on the periphery of North America and way out on the North Atlantic islands, in Iceland and even in Greenland. And the Allies used these bases in order to operate bombing aircraft to provide aerial protection over convoys.
Dönitz was back in the high seas of the North Atlantic. The convoys had been blinded, and the Allies were suffering heavy losses. Then Bletchley Park got a break.
We've got back into the U-boat Enigma in December 42. We discovered that when they were transmitting these short signals, either to report the weather or to report operational material, they only used the 3 wheels of the new machine, because they were 3-letter signals, you see. And we could break the 3 wheels, but we captured a U-boat in the Mediterranean, near the Red Sea, near the Suez Canal.
U-559 had been trapped in the southeast Mediterranean by the Petard, a British Navy destroyer. Its commander, Mark Thornton, was an energetic officer who craved the excitement often missing in a naval patrol. This time he found it. The U-559, starved of oxygen, rose to the surface. The U-boat's crew immediately abandoned ship, and Thornton sent a small boarding party from the Petard. The crucial documents were retrieved by Anthony Fasson, a popular officer aboard the Petard, and Colin Glazier, a young seaman. A third sailor took the documents back to the Petard. Then Fasson and Glazier went back down to look for more secret papers. But earlier gunfire from the Petard had left holes in the U-559. Water was pouring in, and U-559 began to sink.
The people outside shouted down to these 2 men who were down there, "You'd better come up, you'd better come up." But these men started to climb up the ladder, but suddenly the U-559 went down very fast. Too much water was coming in the conning tower, and these men went down with the ship.
Thanks to their valiant sacrifice, British codebreakers were able to decipher Enigma messages once again, and thousands of Allied lives were saved. Fasson and Glazier were posthumously awarded the George Cross. The Allied mariners often faced a fierce North Atlantic, which could be as dangerous as the German U-boats lurking beneath the surface.
Winter gales were simply unending. One came in right after the other. And water came over green over the bridge. And if you weren't dressed properly, it was misery. It was very hard living, particularly down on the mess decks, which were a small, comparatively small space, considering the number of men that were in it. And the place just reeked of vomit and sweat and there's lack of air. You couldn't have anything open, of course, and not nearly enough air came through the louvers. It was extremely difficult condition.
When we compared our life with that of others, like the ones in the trenches, then we could say, we have it so much better than anybody else. We had 3 meals a day, we were dry, we had warm bunks, we ate from tables with linen on it, and we were not nearly suffering as much as everybody else, especially our opponents up on the surface, the corvettes and the frigates of the Allies. We sometimes really felt very sorry for them to have to fight against the Atlantic itself.
These feelings of empathy for the Allies didn't last long as the Germans continued to decrypt their codes and hammer the convoys. By autumn 1942, American single ships were traveling in convoy. The Allies developed a top-secret interlocking coastal convoy system linking South America to the American East Coast and to the Canadian ports of Halifax and Sydney. As the war progressed, the Battle of the Atlantic became a higher priority. More Allied ships and resources were deployed. The talent of the Royal Navy was put on the offensive in the form of the support groups. Designed to counter Dönitz's wolf packs, the support groups were an elite fleet of well-equipped, brilliantly skippered ships that scoured the mid-Atlantic.
These were groups of the most powerful anti-submarine ships, and there would be 4 or 5 very good destroyers or strong sloops, and also an escort aircraft carrier. These support groups operated at mid-ocean, and then when word got out that a convoy was in trouble, the support group would dash to assist that convoy.
Normally, the escort group of the convoy tried to push submarines away, or at least keep them underwater as they sailed on with their cargo. The support groups had no convoy to protect, however. They hunted and killed U-boats. Whenever a submarine tried to approach a convoy, the support group attacked using a variety of sophisticated equipment. Head-throwing mortars, state-of-the-art sonar, radar, and onboard high-frequency direction-finding systems were all employed. The support groups played a crucial role in turning the Battle of the Atlantic to the Allies' favor in May 1943.
You could usually detect the U-boat at about 3,000 yards. And then the echoes, which went out and made a ping when they hit the target, whatever it was, and came back, that measured the distance off of the U-boat. And as you approached, it was under the water, and of course not moving very much. As it got closer and closer and closer, you knew the time was coming when your depth charge crews would be instructed to fire.
We then are subjected to these series of explosions of depth charges around us, and hope for the best that after the next one we're still alive. This is really quite, I would say, a terrifying experience to sit there not being able to do anything but to wait. What is the effect of the next depth charge? If it comes close enough, then the effect is more or less that of a giant sledgehammer on an immovable object. The impact does do all kinds of damage inside the boat.
And then you would be at speed because you always had to go faster than you wanted to go, really, because you had to be ahead of your own depth charge, otherwise you'd be damaged by them.
So this can go on for 6 hours, 12 hours, and hundreds of depth charges. I claim that anybody who says he is not afraid in those situations is a liar.
Dönitz is forced to abandon attacks on convoys because in one of the crucial battles he sinks 11 merchant ships out of a convoy of 40-odd merchant ships. It looks like a brilliant success rate. He lost 6 submarines in doing that. If every time you sink a merchant ship or 2 merchant ships you lose a submarine, you're very quickly going to completely lose your submarine force.
Dönitz was now effectively losing a submarine for every merchant ship he sank.
The United States was building so many ships that the Germans couldn't sink as many as the Allies were building, sometimes 2 or 3 a day. And in the end, it was America's shipbuilding capability that really won the Battle of the Atlantic.
The Allies continued to use their industrial and technological might, as well as their intelligence breakthroughs, to their advantage. Longer-range Royal Air Force and North American Allied aircraft also managed to fill the treacherous black hole above the middle of the North Atlantic.
The value of an aircraft is that it would surprise the submarine while the submarine was on the surface. And the aircraft could do a very fast dive, virtually dive bomb the submarine, and then try to place the bombs across it.
By 1942, more sophisticated aircraft were capable of patrolling at altitudes of up to 5,000 feet.
The moment they saw a submarine, they would plunge from 5,000 feet to 50 feet, right across the hull of the submarine, and drop a stick, a timed stick. They called it a stick of 4 or 6 depth charge. Boom, 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 boom. And hoping that 2 of them would be close enough to the hull of the submarine to blow it up.
We attracted them to convoys, went for them. We knew their refueling points, where a mothership would come in a distant part of the ocean, kill them all off. They had a miserable time.
On the 21st of September, 1943, Winston Churchill had a most satisfying announcement to make. He reported that not one merchant ship had been lost to enemy action in the North Atlantic in the past 3 months. Britain cheered. But the war continued to rage, on land and at sea. Even until the end of the war, U-boats lurked off the American coast and throughout the Atlantic. But with the help of Ultra, the code name for the secret information Bletchley Park was able to provide, the Allies finally won the Battle of the Atlantic.
I myself, for the last days before we surrendered, was listening to the Voice of America on our radio and was being told that the Russians are now fighting about 2 blocks away from where my mother lived in Berlin, you know, and this of course was some very, very unpleasant realization of what's going on over there. In other words, one worried about what was happening in Germany. On the other hand, the fact that what had finally survived when so few actually did was a tremendous relief somehow.
The key to Ultra's contribution, I think, in the Battle of the Atlantic was that ultimately they were able to control the U-boat threat in time to allow the build-up of preparations for the Normandy invasion in 1944. It was really a supreme intelligence weapon of a kind that no power has had before, and probably no power had since that time.
The purpose of intelligence is to optimize a commander's resources. And Ultra enabled him to do this. And by optimizing resources, we were able to shorten the war. And by shortening the war, we saved treasure, we saved lives. That was the ultimate effect of Ultra in World War II.
The duel in the Atlantic was the longest battle of World War II. More than 700 U-boats and over 25,000 German submariners lost their lives, while the Allies sacrificed 2,600 ships and 80,000 soldiers and seamen for their crucial cause. Yet the Battle of the Atlantic was a battle of secrets. Dönitz's major advantage proved to be his Achilles heel. By sending his crucial secret messages through the air and gambling on the infallibility of the Enigma machine, he unwittingly threw victory to the Allies. The key to the Enigma codes was the key to victory.